My name is W.J. Michael Cody, and today is July 8, 2004. I'm in Memphis, Tennessee to interview Thomas R. Prewitt. This interview is taking place as a part of the legal history project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Could you, for the record, tell us your name and where you were born and when you were born?
My name is Thomas Ryan Prewitt. I was born February 18, 1923 in Bolivar, Tennessee, in our home.
Not a hospital in your home?
No, we had no hospitals in Bolivar.
About what size place was Bolivar when you were?
It was about 1,500. I think it's 5,000 now.
And somewhere between Memphis and Nashville and
it's
closer?
It's about 60 miles due east of Bolivar on Highway 60, due east of Memphis on Highway 64.
Well, when you were, if you can recollect back, tell me a little bit about your mother and father and your family, maybe a little history about your family before we start talking about you.
All right, well, I was blessed with two great parents. My father was Allen M. Prewitt, and he graduated from Vanderbilt Law School while World War I was going on, about 1915, I believe it was. And he was a great baseball player. And the Cleveland Indians offered him a contract when he finished law school, but he turned it down because he said he was afraid if he got started playing baseball, he never would practice law, and law was his love. But at any rate, he practiced law in Bolivar until about 41, when he was elected to the Supreme Court, and he served on the Supreme Court for about 22 years and died as Chief Justice on February 17, 1963. If he had lived a few minutes longer, he would have died on my birthday.
Is that right? And that's the Supreme Court of Tennessee?
Right.
And
my mother's name was Miriam Narayan, and she was from Martin, Tennessee. And she came to Bolivar while World War I was going on, because Bolivar needed a French teacher. And she was one of the few French teachers around, I suppose, but she lasted 1 year in Bolivar, and my father was overseas at that time. And when he came back, she had gone back to Martin. But my mother became a close friend of my grandmother. My grandmother extolled the virtues of Miss Ryan when my father got back from World War I. He fought in the trenches. And to make a long story short, he courted her and they got married in 1920, I believe.
And
of course, she was a very well-educated woman. My father was too. So I was very fortunate in growing up in a household where both of them valued education so much. And I heard about law from the time I was 5 years old.
When did you first think that you might be a lawyer? Do you remember?
Well, my grandmother, my father's mother, lived next door to us, and she said I had to be a lawyer when I was a little boy. And I know she said, you must take Latin when you get in high school, because no lawyer can be a finished lawyer unless he knows something about Latin. So I took Latin.
So you felt like from the very start that you certainly were being directed toward the profession that you ended up in.
Yes, and my father loved to try murder. He had tried an awful lot of murder cases. I know he told me one time that none of his defendants ever got to switch. A lot of them were convicted, I'm sure, but he was very proud of that record. And I used to go to the courthouse in Bolivar when I was a boy and watch them try those. Of course, people weren't interested in the civil cases. And Bolivar had a pretty big auditorium for the courthouse. I mean, for the courtroom. So.
And I guess lawyers back in those days, and judges too, they kind of rode a circuit around, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Similar to Abraham Lincoln in Illinois.
Right.
My father would try cases. Of course, they didn't have horse and buggies like they did in Lincoln's day, but he would drive over to Somerville or Brownsville or Selma and try cases around the circuit.
You grew up there in Bolivar, went to school through high school in Bolivar?
Right. We had one big red building. It was built in 1868. Two-story, tremendous. It was the largest building in Hardeman County, I suppose, because it housed all 12 grades. And I went to that one building for 12 years.
Well, we're going to get into it later, but you've sort of been lucky in your life. You only went to one school and you've been in one law firm, but that's
right.
A little later to our story.
For 56 and a half years in this law firm.
Right. Well, now, once you graduated from high school, did you go to college or what happened?
Well, I went to college at UT Junior College in Martin. That was a successor to Hall Moody, which my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he was one of the founders, Thomas McAtee Ryan. I was named for him. And my grandmother had a big house in Martin, and while my grandfather was fairly successful, he had some real reverses shortly before he died, and she had to sell off farms to live during the Depression. And she rented rooms to students that went to junior college because her house was just a short distance from the campus. And so I spent my time there with my grandmother. And that's the reason
While you were in school?
Yes, and that's why I went to the junior college. She was very anxious, and my brother also went there. So I went to the junior college, not quite 2 years, and that's when I went into the Air Force.
Air Force. Well, so your college career was just two years or so, and then
it was a year and 2 quarters.
A year and 2 quarters,
Right.
So less than 2 years. And so before you ever went to law school, you went in the service?
Right, I went in the service. I volunteered for the Air Force. And I went in the service about 1st of April of 1943.
Well, how did, I know the war started in 1941 or so, and how did you get drafted, or did you volunteer? Or?
No, I wasn't drafted. I wanted to get a commission, but I hadn't had any ROTC or that sort of thing. And I didn't want to be in the infantry because of the tales my father had told me about World War I, sleeping in trenches. Waking up one morning, he said an airplane, ACAC, was going down his trench. And he said the living conditions were horrible. And so I had a very dim view of the infantry from the time I was a little boy.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, so the Air Force looked like the best thing, and I had a lot of mathematics and science at the junior college, and I wanted to be a navigator, not a pilot.
Right.
I never was very athletic as far as my dexterity was lacking, and I figured I'd have a hard time being a pilot. But at any rate,
so you just joined the Army Air Force?
I joined the Army Air Force, and we spent about 5 months going back to college. So I had enough time when I got out of the Air Force, I could enter law school immediately. You had to have 2 years.
Right.
But they gave me credit for my Air Force time.
And where did they send you to somewhere in the United States to get your flight preparation?
Yes,
and all
I got
that?
most of it in Houston, Texas. That's where I went to navigation school, about 5 or 6 months in navigation school. And I went to Memphis State for 3 months in college and a Catholic school in Missouri, Kansas City, for 2 months.
All while you were in the Air Force?
All while I was in the Air Force,
Okay.
right.
And so after that preparation and training here in this country, did you get assigned to some base here in the United States, or what?
Yes, I was in Tucson, Arizona, Davis-Monthan Field for 2 months in I guess it was May and June of 1944, and we picked up our airplane. That's where the crews got together, and we got operational training, just like real missions. I learned how to be a gunner and learned how to drop bombs, and of course I was already a navigator, but we had additional training, and then we picked up our own B-24 airplane.
And that, for people that may not know as much as you do about the Air Force, that's a big long-distance bomber, is it not?
It was the largest bomber, that along with the B-17 that we had at that time, and we had 10 crew members.
In the B-24?
In
for
the
each
B-24,
mission.
and a pilot and a co-pilot. And we flew our own plane all the way from, actually we picked it up in Lincoln, Nebraska. From Lincoln, Nebraska, we flew to our air base in Italy, 15th Air Force.
Okay, so you went from in the plane that you eventually would fly on your war missions, you flew it to where your base was going to be in Italy.
Right.
And what was the name of the place where the base was in Italy? What part of Italy was it in?
It was called Pantanella, but it was about 10 miles from the Adriatic and due east from Naples, across the boot of Italy. That's in that general area were all of the 15th Air Force bases, consisting mainly of B-24s and B-17s, and a lot of fighter planes too.
And about what year or what time would it have been when you actually arrived there in Italy ready to start an active war career?
It was mid-August of 1944.
44. And
we slept outside the first night and got up early the next morning and went to Prewitt oil fields.
When you say you went, that means you got in your airplane, you went over there with some bombs, huh?
That's right.
So you didn't stay around getting a lot of training once you hit the ground.
We had
in
no
Italy.
time at all. We slept outside on cots. We got a tent in a few days, and they woke us up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and went into a big briefing tent and saw where we were going, and we were assigned to different crews.
Right.
We didn't fly with our same crew for the first few missions. That was to get us acclimated to the situation, more or less.
Well, I know that sometimes they don't tell everybody exactly what the mission is, but in your case, did you have a special assignment on generally what these missions were for? Or?
Well, in the first place, we never knew what mission we were going on until we got into this big briefing tent that had a map of Europe on it. The first, I'll call it sorties, we had to fly. They changed the rules of the game on us, but we had to fly 35 sorties. That means actual trips.
Out and back.
Round trips, yes. And we started off having to fly 50 missions, but we got double credit for many missions. But the first, I'd say, 20 sorties, I did not fly in a lead plane.
What do you mean by lead plane? Or
Well,
is there a formation of many of these
yes,
bombers?
each squadron in the 15th Air Force had about 7 airplanes, 7 heavy bombers. And each group, we had 4 squadrons in the group. And our group was 464th Bomb Group. So that would be about 28 heavy bombers per group. And then we were in the, I believe it was the 55th Wing. That was, the headquarters was in a place called Spinazzola, Italy. And I believe there were 5 or 6 groups in each wing. And then after the wing was the Air Force, the 15th Air Force. So the first 20 missions, a lot of them we didn't have a bombardier because I would drop the bombs as navigator.
I see.
I didn't use the bomb sight, but I just used a switch to bomb on the lead plane.
In other words, when the lead plane started dropping bombs and the people in the formation, you would drop your bomb.
We would call it toggling. And after about the 20th sortie, I started flying in a lead plane. First, it would be the squadron. And then after a few missions as squadron leader, I flew as group leader, 28 planes.
And so then you would be the one who first dropped the bombs?
No, we did have a bombardier on some of those earlier flights, but I'd say on about half of them, we didn't have a bombardier.
Okay. And what was the general purpose that you learned at these briefings of what you were to do? What was the general assignment for your operation?
Well, we first had that big picture on a big map on the board of our flight area, and we could our maximum flight was 600 miles. We could hit any target within a radius of 600 miles from our base.
So you'd get over into Czechoslovakia and Poland and...
Poland and, of course, large parts of Germany, Austria, Romania, Ploesti oil fields, and northern Italy. We bombed northern Italy quite a bit in aid of the ground troops. So...
and once you got stabilized, did you generally fly with the same men?
Yes. Once we got stabilized, as I say, we all flew on different planes the first few missions. And I know our pilot and engineer were lost on that first mission, but they were, of course, on a different plane.
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering, once you saw the deaths and the losses of people you were flying with like that, did you think maybe you'd been better off in the Army, or were you always happier that you chose the Air Force?
No, I was still happy, and actually at 21 years of age, I just was confident I could make it. And of course, we were all frightened. Of course, we had many frightening experiences, but I don't know, maybe the good Lord, when you're 21 years old, you just got to, that's why old men send young men off to war. Yeah. Young men are not as fearful.
But some of these friends that you spent these flights with, they didn't return, did they?
No. And I remembered a quotation from Sir Thomas Gray's elegy written in the country churchyard. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare, and full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. And that's what happened to so many boys or men 21 years old, my age. Instead of coming back, they are still over there in those cemeteries all over Europe. Yes, it was tough.
You never knew once you got in the airplane headed out whether your airplane was going to be one that would
That's right, and many's the time I can remember a group coming into our squadron, and they slept outside just like we did the first night, but we got to meet them. They were right outside of our tent. And I went out and met the 4 officers, the pilot and the co-pilot and the bombardier and the navigator. And the next day, they didn't come back. And I didn't learn what happened to them until after the war. And they were all killed. but we didn't know what happened. We just knew that it didn't come back.
And I
So
think
that happened quite a few times, I remember. It's pretty hard to put numbers on it, but of course we realized every day when we went up there that, and we lost more planes because of malfunction and pilot error than we did in actual combat. Because wartime conditions being what they were putting out those B-24s at that River Rouge plant in Detroit in mass production. So there were a lot of flaws in those planes. Yeah. And of course we had to fly practically every day in the good weather, and it kept all those ground crewmen busy just keeping them airborne.
Right. So you would just fly your mission, come back, get something to eat and rest, and suit up again and
sometimes we would fly several days in a row, and sometimes we'd have bad weather and there'd be several days we wouldn't fly. But in the fall of the year, when I was doing most of my flying, we had awful good weather. So
well, let me ask you, Tom, if what were your sort of, I know the area you described of your targets, but what was the objective? What were you trying to do for the war effort?
The objective of the 15th Air Force, see, the 8th Air Force out of England was the main bombing strength of the American Air Force in Europe, but they couldn't reach Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia and Romania. And by the time I got there, most of the German synthetic oil plants were beyond the reach of England. And that was really the purpose of the 15th Air Force.
Because you were farther east, and so your range would then get to those...
We could reach those synthetic oil plants, which were Germany's lifeline, and the Ploesti oil fields. And they couldn't reach them from England, so that our job was to knock them out.
Right.
And I think the 15th did a great job, because by Christmas time, Germany was just about out of fuel.
That'd be Christmas of '44, huh?
Right.
And so you served in the Air Force until about June of '45.
Yes, and I finished my missions about Christmas of '44.
Okay, that's
but
what
it was about 4 months before I got my orders to return to the U.S.
So when you came back to the U.S. and had finished your missions, your requirement, then were you through with your Air Force? Were you relieved of duty and out once you got back to the United States?
No, it was about I know we were on the ship. I didn't fly back on an airplane. I came on a troop ship, and Franklin Roosevelt died while we were in the Atlantic, and it was, and then the war ended in Germany, I believe about May the 1st. At any rate, when the war ended, I was at a rest camp in Miami Beach, Florida, and the very next day they put a notice on the bulletin board that if you had so many points, you could either get a reserve commission or you could stay in if you wanted to, or you could get out. I took the latter.
You'd done your job and
well,
wanted to go do something else.
I wanted to go to law school.
Right. Well, I know you're reluctant sometimes to brag about yourself, but as a result of these 50 missions and the work that you did, I know that you got the Distinguished Flying Cross and the 3 Oak Leaf Cluster Awards.
Yes, I did, and I was very proud of it, because not too many navigators got the DFC.
Well, that was, I knew that was one of the honors that you had received. So you took advantage of the opportunity to quit being in the Air Force, the war being basically over, and came back to what was your original intention since your grandmother and father started talking to you about going to law school.
Yeah, that was my hopes and dreams from the time I was a little boy.
And when you came back, because of your Army, Air Force education, you had enough credits to go straight into law school. Is that correct?
That's right. I know I didn't have a bit of trouble. Of course, they were begging for students. Very few of the boys were out. I was the first person in my county to get out of the Army on points.
Mm-hmm.
So I was home by the 1st of June, I guess.
That'd be June of 45.
Yeah, and I worked at Chickasaw Park as a lifeguard that summer. It was only about 15 miles from my home.
And then you went to, what, the University of Tennessee
Then I
Law
went
School?
to Knoxville, the University of Tennessee.
And started there in the fall of 1945?
Right.
And did you go to law school a full 3 years, or did you?
I went every summer. So I finished in the fall. I finished just before Christmas of 47.
Okay.
Went to summer school 2 years. I was anxious to get out of law school, just like I was anxious to get out of the Air Force. So I was only, I was just 25 years old when I started practicing law.
And at that time, was your father on the Supreme Court, or is he still practicing law? I think you.
No, he was on the Supreme Court. He went on the Supreme Court when I was in school at Martin.
Right. And so he was still on the Supreme Court.
Yes, he was still on the Supreme Court.
And did you think you'd go back to Martin to practice law, or what did you?
No, I know when I finished law school, my brother Alan had graduated ahead of me, and he went to Bolivar and he was practicing law, and he was in my father's old law office. It had all the library and typewriter, and he was all set to practice law. But I didn't want to practice law in a small town, because I remember back during the Depression, my father would come home in the afternoon, and so many times I would hear him say, "We've got hard times," because I know he got paid in eggs and watermelons and produce and everything else, because they say at least a fourth of people were out of work. But I knew how tough it was and how hard he had to work. Mm-hmm. And he worked hard, 7 days a week, but he was very diligent in his law practice. But I saw how tough it was, and I didn't want any part of a small town law practice, because, and he told me this, that you can't afford to turn anybody down in a small town. Right. Bolivar had about 2,000 people, and he said, you get the reputation of turning people down, the first thing you know, you don't have any practice. I wanted to practice law in a city.
Well, what did you know people in Memphis or Nashville? Or how did you
yes,
decide
and I had some, I could have gone to Nashville, or I could have stayed in Knoxville. I had some real good friends among the lawyers in Knoxville. And I debated it, but I had gotten married this last year in college, last year in law school, to a girl from Memphis, and she wanted to go to Memphis, and I really leaned towards Memphis, because at that time, Memphis had a great reputation for being a good place to practice law, really better than Nashville, I thought. And it was close to my hometown of Bolivar. Right. Although I thought Nashville was a great place too.
So did you?
So I started in Memphis.
How did you? I mean, you know, I remember in my own case how I started, but did you pick up the phone, call somebody, or go interview, or did you have somebody recommend you, or how'd that work?
Well, there was no such thing as recruiting young lawyers in 1948, January of 48. And you would have thought there'd have been a shortage of lawyers, but there wasn't. And so many of my classmates just couldn't get on. They had to start adjusting insurance. Some of them joined the FBI. It was
hard to get.
It was not a good market for young lawyers, and I had made no effort to locate a possible place in Memphis before I got to Memphis. I started right after Christmas, I guess it was, of '47, and I just went into several law firms unannounced. Now, I did have the advantage of my father being very well known.
Right. That didn't hurt you, did it?
No, it certainly didn't as a starter.
Right.
And I remember going to see Mr. Lee Winchester and Captain Walter Chandler and Mr. John Exby, who was a partner of Mr. Marion Evans, and Mr. Walter Armstrong. I tried to talk to the top men, and Mr. Armstrong was alive then.
Right.
He didn't live but a year and a half after that, but...
This would be Walter Armstrong Sr.
That was Walter Armstrong Sr., and of course, my father made these suggestions about who to go see, and I know Mr. Exby said, well, don't really have a place for you, but if you can't get on, come back here and I'll find a place for you.
Right.
And Mr. Exby died the next year, and I always remembered him, how kind he was to me. They were all kind.
Uh-huh.
But Mr. Armstrong, I went in and talked to him, and he asked me a few questions, and he said, leave your place where I can reach you. I want to talk to my other partners. We said, we got 5 partners, Armstrong, McCadden, Allen, Braden, and Goodman, and we've all got to discuss it. Well, the next day he called. He said, come on up here. So I started January 1, 1948.
And so you interviewed for the job one day and started work the next, huh?
Well, it was very shortly after that.
And you know, back in those days, I doubt it was like it is now. The salary probably didn't knock you over, did it?
$200 a month. I remember it very emphatically, and I know about 6 months later, John Heiskell had just been elected Attorney General of Shelby County, and he came in my office and said, I want you to go down to the criminal court with me. Mr. Will Gerber had resigned, and I said, well, John, I knew John Heiskell, although he was a good deal older than I was. I said, what's the salary? I had I didn't have any children then, but I know.
In other words, Mr. Gerber he had been the district attorney?
Yes.
And he died, and John
No, he didn't die. Will Gerber resigned.
Resigned, and John Heiskell was going to be the new district attorney?
Right. John.
He wanted you to be...
He wanted me to be one of the assistants. They had 4 criminal courts, and I think they only had 4 assistants in. Now they tell me they got about 75.
Okay.
But John said that the salary was $3,900 a year. Well, I was making $200 a month. And I talked to Mr. Armstrong and my father both about it. And they next day said no, under no circumstances. And I said, well, Mr. Armstrong, I'm having a little trouble eating. And he said, we'll raise your salary right now. So he raised me to $250 a month.
So you threatened to leave and got a big promotion. Well, who was in the firm then? You mentioned Walter Armstrong Sr., of course.
And Mr. Ed McCadden, Mr. Seddon Allen, Emmett Braden, and Ben Goodman. And Walter Jr., I don't think Walter was, I believe he became a partner the year I came in '48, Walter Jr.
So Walter Jr. was at the firm, but not a partner.
Right.
And so
I believe it was that same year he became a partner, and and there were 11 lawyers. I was the 11th lawyer. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 Yale graduates, 2 Harvard graduates out of that 11, and Mr. Seddon went to the University of Tennessee, and then Mr. Ed McCadden never went to law school. And we had one of the few lady lawyers, Miss Catherine Watson, who sort of was the boss of the office. Uh-huh. She practiced in the probate courts, and there may have been 2 or 3 lady lawyers in Memphis then. There weren't very many, I know.
And from the time you got in there, I'm sure they gave you a lot of work to do. Were you a transactional lawyer, they'd say these days, or were you a trial lawyer?
No, I've been a trial lawyer from day one. And Mr. Armstrong was my mentor, Mr. Armstrong Sr. He had been president of the American Bar Association, I think, in 1940. And then in 1931, right after Roosevelt was elected president, he was selected to be Solicitor General of the United States, Mr. Armstrong Sr. But the designated Attorney General died before Roosevelt was inaugurated. So that Mr. Armstrong lost that position. But it's an indication of the reputation of Mr. Armstrong throughout the country.
And he had basically started the firm that you've been in all your life, he and his partners.
Yes, he and, well, it was Armstrong, McCadden, and Allen.
And when did the predecessor of your firm, Mr. Armstrong Sr.'s firm, when did it actually start? How old would it be today?
Well, it was about 1930, and it was formed from 3 smaller firms. Now, you got to realize that in 1948, we had 11 lawyers when I came in, and I was told we were the largest law firm in Tennessee.
Right.
There weren't any large law firms. Most of the firms, all of the participants were in the name.
Right.
Now, your old firm was, well, Birch, Porter, and Johnson, but it was Birch, Minor, and McKay before that. But
That's right.
the policy was to put everybody's name in the firm in these real small firms. But this firm that Mr. Armstrong formed was really a merger of 3 small firms: McKellar, Kaiser, and Allen. That was Senator McKellar.
Right.
And Sibley, Evans, and McCadden. That was Mr. Marion Evans.
Right.
And the third one was Wilson, Gates, and Armstrong.
So that was
And Judge Wilson, I think, retired. He said he didn't want to go in a big law firm.
with 11 people, 10 or 11.
Judge Wilson retired, and Mr. Gates, I know, died very shortly after that. So it was an amalgamation of those 3 small firms.
And when you started there, did you do any kind of work, or would you specialize in anything?
Well, from the first day, Mr. Armstrong got me in, and he told me 2 things that I remember. And he said, first, if you want to make money, quit right now and start in some business, because you'll never make a lot of money practicing law. And the second thing was, he says, he wasn't disparaging what you call transactional lawyers, but he
Office
said,
lawyers.
Yeah, but he led me to believe that he thought the real lawyers were the trial lawyers. He said they're the ones that make and shape the law, not the business lawyers. So, and then Emmett Braden sort of took me over, and he was
He was a good trial lawyer, wasn't he?
He was a great trial lawyer. So I was a very fortunate young man to get started with great lawyers like Emmett Braden and Mr. Armstrong Sr. And all the other senior partners were so kind to me.
And who were some of the major people in those early days that you and your law firm did work for, the companies or
Well,
insurance?
I know this, that the firm represented General Motors, General Electric, Ford Motor Company, a lot of what you call the Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of insurance companies, a couple of railroads, and the one that kept me so busy was the Memphis Street Railway.
The bus company, or
The bus company,
trolleys
it
too,
was
I guess.
owned privately at that time, and Colonel Waring was the president. And my firm and Colonel Waring's firm each tried about half of the cases. And they had a case a day coming up with all these buses around.
And so you were mainly in those days defending insurance companies or train?
I started off defending insurance companies, some railroads, and the Memphis Street Railway, but I got into, right off the bat, into a lot of other things too. I know we represented General Electric Company, and this was about 1949, I believe, or 50, and they had a strike at General Electric Company, and I stayed up all night with Mr. McCadden and Ben Goodman dictating a complaint for filing in the Chancery Court to a stenographer. Of course, I didn't do any of the dictating. Mr. McCadden and Goodman were doing it, but once we got it filed, it was General Electric's policy in those days not to close business, to go on operating with whoever would work. Well, that created a lot of discord among the union people, and invariably violence. When scabs would try to go to work across the line, they'd have violence, and so I handled the courtroom part of that.
So you handled anything that came into your firm. You started to become the trial lawyer.
Well, I just I got into so many things right off the bat, and I think, Mike, in retrospect, that how lucky I was when I've known so many good lawyers in Memphis that had the ability, but never had a chance because they never got the right kind of business.
I guess what you're sort of saying, that you were lucky that you came in to a group of lawyers who already had business that you could work on and who could mentor you and show you how to be.
Right, because the first few years, every time I went to court, Mr. Braden was with me, but I started doing all the work right away because he had just about burned out trying those insurance cases back during the Depression.
And he wanted you to start doing that.
Yeah, he wanted to burn me out.
Well,
and it damn near did.
Well, you mentioned to me when we were talking earlier that about 1958, you had to have a little conference with some of your partners about that.
I'll never forget that as long as I live. We had just finished a circuit court term, jury term of, I believe it was 13 weeks. It was the September term. And I had a case during that 13 weeks. Every day of that term, I was trying a case. And I would go from one case to another. In those days, if you finished one case and you had another one waiting and there was a court open, we had 4 circuit courts, they would take it. So I went from one case to another, almost without delay.
So you could have a jury waiting in one court and you started another case?
But on top of that, I would interview witnesses in the next case while I was trying the case. I did have a lot of help from the street railway. A lot of them were street railway cases.
Claim agents and things.
They handled all the getting the witnesses. Right. They issued the subpoenas, and they'd bring them down to the courthouse, and that's the first time I'd talk to them.
So it wasn't like we see today where a trial lawyer will have 2 or 3 associates and a couple of paralegals and some clerks all running around there.
No, sir, and in many of those cases I had no help. And I remember at the end of the day, it was Thursday, at the end of that term, I went back to my office and I asked Mr. McCadden and Mr. Braden to come in that I wanted to talk to them.
This is 1958.
1958, 10 years after I started. And I said to them, well, I told them what I'd done, and it was not only that term, I'd been doing that on a lesser, but that's the first time I ever had no time in a jury term. But it had been, I'd been trying cases for the railroads, I'd had insurance companies, and some plaintiffs' cases, some workman's compensation. I know we had a workman's comp case in the Supreme Court that's reported. but all different kinds of litigation. And I got into chancery court cases, federal court. I was arguing them in the appellate courts. I had a lot of cases reported during that first 10 years. I was so busy, and I said, I don't know what's going to happen, but something's got to give. I can't go on doing this. And they agreed right away. They took most of the insurance work away from me. I didn't like that. And they took all the street railway work away from me immediately and gave it to other lawyers in the firm.
So you kind of were able to broaden what you were doing.
And the reason I wanted to do that was I saw what happened to Emmett Braden. At age 50, he was burned out because of his experience during the Depression trying those cases. Of course, they were good cases then. At least the insurance companies could pay you.
Right.
And your partner, John Porter, had a big effect on my career in the sense that John told me that insurance companies are the worst kinds of clients because they don't appreciate what you do. The fellow that you're doing business with one day won't be there the next day, so there's no gratitude.
Well, I want to jump ahead 10 years because I want to use what John Porter told you and your thinking there to talk about the Shell Oil case. And I think that was another watershed year for you, wasn't it?
That was about 1968. And I had gotten rid of most of the insurance practice by that time. But I was still representing a major company in the tough cases. It got so they weren't sending me anything but the real tough cases. The cases where you could make a little fee on the settlements and the workman's comp things, miners settlements, workman's comp settlements, and miners settlements. We charged the minimum fee, but a lot of lawyers started charging less than the minimum fee, so they'd send all that easy stuff to these other lawyers.
And you get stuck with the cases.
And I got stuck with the tough ones.
Yeah.
So that Shell Oil case, I remember that because it was another watershed in my life, just like 1958 was.
Well, I'm gonna interrupt you just a minute because I'm gonna read something that you probably wouldn't say, but I want to make a point about that case. And Judge Robert McCrae, who we know just died recently, a federal judge and a great judge around here, had a magazine article written about him, and they asked him about the best lawyers he had ever run into and why they were the best. And I'm going to just read you something he said because you might not say it. Judge McCrae said this: I've seen so many good and bad lawyers. I've observed lawyers, trial lawyers in particular. I started early on telling my wife, now, if I'm run over by a truck, this is a lawyer I want you to go to. The first one was John Porter, who was a very sharp lawyer and a no-nonsense lawyer, and he went right to the issues. And I've seen him on both sides of the case. The next one I saw that came along was Tom Prewitt. And Tom, I remember, he had a case representing an oil company, that there was some smog out there, and after they opened the interstate, there was a dump and there was smog, and a Shell Oil Company truck had come along and run into the back of at least 2 carloads of people. And the city was sued, and all the injured were packed in the cars, and all of them had different lawyers and every theory you could think of. And Tom Prewitt took that case and picked his theory about why that wreck occurred, and he stuck to that theory and presented his witnesses, and the jury went out, and I remember amazingly, the jury came back in something like 8 minutes for Prewitt's defendants in that horrible case. And one of the lawyers for the plaintiff told me later it would have been shorter, except one of the jurors had to go to the bathroom. Now, is that the Shell Oil case you're talking about?
That's the Shell Oil case, but I remember it because it was a real watershed in my legal career. It was about 1968, because that's the date of the publication of the Sixth Circuit opinion, because it would appeal to the Sixth Circuit. So that was 1968, and I know I sent the insurance company a bill for $20,000, and several people told me that I was too cheap and that I should have sent it for much more, because we had about 4 or 5 deaths, and young people with children on. It was tough. I could foresee a pretty good-sized verdict coming in, although I felt pretty confident of my theory. But at any rate, I sent that bill in, and the first thing I knew, the local representative, whom I hadn't had much experience with, wanted to cut me down.
We didn't want to pay the whole fee that
Didn't
you
want to
charged.
pay the whole fee, wanted me to reduce it. I said, I'm not going to reduce it 1 cent. And furthermore, don't send me any more cases. And that's, for all practical purposes, the end of my career as an insurance company lawyer.
And are you, just like you were happy to go to the Air Force and not being in the trenches in the Army, were you happy as your career continued?
Yes, because it was so much more enjoyable, and I was so lucky, as I said, Mike, to get the type of cases that were challenging and interesting. So I feel very fortunate about that. I got into so many different things that were interesting, and I really enjoyed it.
And I think I remember back during that period of time, you represented a lot of governmental agencies and Supreme Court justices, and broader practice than you had had before.
I had just about every conceivable kind of civil case: will contests, eminent domain, divorce cases, which I never liked, but I took a lot of them. It's just every kind of case.
Did you ever have any cases that went up to the Court of Appeals or even the United States Supreme Court?
Yes, I personally argued a case in the United States Supreme Court. I was representing the city of Memphis, in Watson against the city of Memphis. It was a Park Commission case, and I was the lawyer for the Park Commission beginning about 1959, I believe, for 20-some odd years. And I really enjoyed the work because it was sort of a relaxation for me.
And so that was...
But at any rate, that was one of the cases, was the integration of the park facilities.
Okay.
And we were successful in both the trial court and in the Court of Appeals. And of course, we had to accept the fact that parks had to be open to all the races, and the Park Commission had been doing that. They'd done a pretty good job, I thought, in opening up everything. And but we lost it in the Supreme Court. But I argued it 2 days in the Supreme Court.
No, wait,
Chief Justice Warren was Chief Justice Warren was presiding. Because I remember Justice...
I never heard of a two-day argument.
Yes, because I was the last one on the calendar that first day. And one of my positions was that the Park Commission has adopted what the school board called a stair-step program of integrating the schools
in stages.
And since so many of the park facilities were used and owned in common with the school board, I thought, it was my idea, that the best way is to go right along with the school board. Their stair-step plan had been approved, and the Court of Appeals approved it. Judge Marion,
Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals approved it.
And Judge Marion Board, district judge, approved it, and there were 3 judges from Michigan that all approved it.
On the Sixth Circuit?
Yes, but the Supreme Court reversed it, like the Brown against Board of Education, no dissents.
Right. Unanimous against you, but you had 2 days that oral
Well,
argument.
the first day I started arguing, well, as soon as I opened my mouth, they started asking questions. And I must have been on my feet for 45 minutes when you were supposed to argue 20 minutes. And then Judge Warren then said, well, Mr. Prewitt, or he had asked me something about the status of the schools integration, and I didn't have that answer right on the tip of my tongue. He said, well, will you find out and come back and tell us in the morning? I said, I'll do my best. So I called up Jack Petrie from Washington, and he gave me the answer.
Jack Petrie was the lawyer for the school board.
He was a lawyer for the school board, and then I went back, first thing that morning, I went in, and Judge Barnes said, Mr. Prewitt, you may continue. Do you have that information? I said, I do, and I gave it to him, and I was on my feet for another 20 or 30 minutes.
I don't think I have ever heard of a situation where the Supreme Court of the United States asked somebody to come back the next day with an answer.
That's exactly what happened. So it was a great experience. And
well, during any of this time when you were, trying all these cases, Memphis and the Sixth Circuit and other places, did you ever get tempted away from just practicing law and do something with the government? Or?
No, well, of course I did. In 1954, I went to Washington as a lawyer for the Senate, assistant counsel to Ray Jenkins in the Army McCarthy hearing.
All right, now, when you say the Army McCarthy, is that Senator Joe McCarthy?
That's Senator Joe McCarthy.
And what was how did you get involved, being a Memphis lawyer, how did you get involved in that?
Ray Jenkins, a lawyer from Knoxville, and I knew of Mr. Jenkins. He was quite a famous lawyer in Knoxville. In fact, I went up to the courthouse and watched him try some cases, both in the state court and the federal court.
When you were in law school?
Yeah, when I was in law school, and I knew Mr. Jenkins and thought the world of him. And he called me out of the blue and said he wanted me to be his assistant in Washington, and my law firm all agreed to let me do it, and they said they'd stand behind me and pay my expenses and whatnot. So that's how I got to be there, and I stayed 3 months in the Mayflower Hotel next to Mr. Jenkins, who had a suite.
And what was your role in those hearings? And
Well,
tell me a little bit about what was the nature of the investigation.
It was, they said it was one of the first hearings, Senate hearings, held on television. So it was nationwide television. And Mr. Crump would call me every time I'd come home. He wanted to know everything about it.
Now, the Mr. Crump we're talking about is Edward Crump, who was either for many, many years the mayor of Memphis or determined who would be the mayor of Memphis. And
well, Mr. Crump died a few months after that.
And he was sort of the political force
But
here.
he was very interested in what was going on in Washington. But to get back to your question about it, was a controversy between Joe McCarthy, who was the chairman of the Senate Senate Government Operations Committee, subcommittee of that, subcommittee on investigations. And Joe McCarthy was the chairman of that subcommittee, and he had been extensively investigating the U.S. Army, claiming they had communists behind every bush in the Army. And so it was ripe for controversy between McCarthy and the Army. There was a private in the Army named David Shine who worked on McCarthy's committee. And the Army accused McCarthy of using undue pressure to bring preferential treatment to this private. And it got to be a real controversy nationwide.
And so you and Mr. Jenkins were sort of lawyers for the committee?
We were lawyers for this committee of 7 senators, 3 Republicans, because they controlled the Senate, and 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Senator Carl Munt was the chairman.
Okay. And you would actually examine witnesses
yes,
for the...
and my main job was to interview witnesses and take their depositions. And we'd decide whether or not to call them in open hearing. And I would handle the subpoena of all the witnesses. And I had to get permission from Chairman Munt. But he told me, he said, whoever you want to subpoena, I'll approve it. He just gave me carte blanche.
You had a lot of power to bring people in to their own television.
We had subpoena authority throughout the United States. And so I did subpoena quite a few people, and I had that job, and then I interviewed quite a number of witnesses in open hearing.
I was wondering whether in that, all of us know that Senator McCarthy was on the front page of newspapers all over the world with that investigation. Did you ever have any personal dealings with him?
Yes, I did, very much so. His office was close to the caucus room, which is this tremendous, big, ornate room where they hold, where they were holding various hearings. And I went around to his office one day for some reason. Maybe I went in there with him, and he had a big map in his office, and he had all these red dots all over the country. And he says, "Tom, every place there's a red dot, the communists are ready to sabotage some insulation right there." And then after that, I was interviewing or questioning as a lawyer a witness named Alsop. He was quite a famous
newspaper person.
Yeah, a newspaper. His name was Stuart.
That's right, Stuart Alsop.
Alsop, but I had taken his deposition, I think, and we decided we'd put him on in open hearing. And Mr. Jenkins' procedure in examining all the witnesses was he would first directly examine them as if he were the putting on the witness, and then he would cross-examine them. That was his modus operandi.
I see.
So I followed that same modus operandi. And so I questioned Mr. Alsop to bring out his position. He had written many articles that were very adverse to McCarthy. Of course, he wasn't alone in that, but he was one of the top people. And then I started cross-examining him, and Joe McCarthy thought I did a great job of cross-examining him, and I guess because right after that he said, "Come on, have lunch with me." So we went over to a little cafe that was right across the street from the Senate office building, and had lunch. And the first thing McCarthy did, of course, he had already told me, I'd call him Senator, and he said, "You call me Joe." I said, "Well, I don't feel right calling you Joe," but he said, "I want you to." He had been a circuit judge, he told me, in Wisconsin, and he'd seen lawyers in operation. Of course, he was certainly flattering me. But then we sat down to have lunch, and he ordered 2 double Manhattans, bourbons, and drank them, and I said, I probably called him Joe by then. I said, "Joe, my goodness, how can you do that and keep going?" He said, I've got to do it." And I noticed after that, he had 2 double Manhattans, that it was in the afternoons that he would have his, what I'd call tirades, where he would just almost ranting sometimes, whereas in the mornings he was very jovial, he was very personable, but after a couple of drinks, it changed him.
And that kind of caused his downfall,
I think it did. That hearing, it went on for 3 months, really was the start of Senator McCarthy's downfall. He was shortly thereafter censored by the Senate, and he died, I think, of cirrhosis of the liver a short time later.
Well, I want us to take a little break, but when we come back, I want to mention another person that is of some notoriety that worked in those hearings with you. But if we could, let's take just a short break.
All right. Are we running over time?
Tom, before we took our break, we were talking about the McCarthy hearings and you and Ray Jenkins' work there for the committee. Was there another person that you got to know that was interesting and later very historical in that process?
Yes, indeed. Bob Kennedy. Of course, Bob was a brother of John Kennedy, later president. And incidentally, John Kennedy was a member of this same government operations committee.
So he was on the committee that you were the counsel for.
Yes, but he was not a member of the investigations committee. But he was a member of the full committee, and I got to know him fairly well. I went to his office a couple of times while I was there. But Bob Kennedy, his younger brother, had been employed by McCarthy. He had been a special counsel for the McCarthy's investigating committee in some particulars. And I know this, I was in Bob's house a couple of times, and the first picture I saw when I opened that door was Joe McCarthy.
In Bobby Kennedy's
Bobby
house?
Kennedy's house. And of course, I know his father was pretty much a booster of McCarthy, old man Kennedy.
Joe Kennedy, the father.
But at any rate, Bob was so nice to me because he would drive me back to the Mayflower Hotel many times when we finished, and we'd always go in the bar and have a drink. And he told me that he would never practice law, and I don't think he ever did. He had gone to the University of Virginia law school, and he hadn't been out of law school too long, because he was 2 or 3 years younger than I was. But he said that he wanted to devote his life to public service. That he had a smart father, and he didn't have to have the money and that sort of thing. I said, well, I don't have some of those attributes.
No, he never was a real lawyer in most lawyers' estimation, but was Attorney General of the United States.
That's right. But at any rate, I know after I finished, Bob sent me a 3-volume transcript of the hearings, which I was glad to get, and I've got it in my office now. And then in January of the following year, he called me up and said he wanted me to be his guest at a meeting of the Junior Chamber of Commerce 10 Young Men of the Year. It was in, I believe, the old Brown Hotel in Louisville. So my wife and I went up there, and we had adjoining rooms to Bob and his wife. She was about 8 months pregnant,
That's
I know.
Ethel Kennedy?
Yeah, and so he spent practically the whole night, first night, in my room. And we were drinking Jack Daniel's whiskey. I always took a bottle of Jack Daniel's with me, and he liked it. So we just sat up there like 2 young punks and drinking that whiskey, and he spent a good deal of time trying to convince me. See, the Democrats had won control of the Senate in that election in the fall of '54.
Right.
And so Bob was general counsel for the investigations committee then, because the Democrats controlled it. And so he was about to embark, he said, on Hoffa's investigation, I believe it was, something.
Right, the Jimmy Hoffa, who was the Teamster boss.
But he wanted me to come up there with him. He had never tried a lawsuit in his life. He'd never taken a deposition. And I guess he wanted somebody to take deposition. But at any rate...
Or somebody that could be their lawyer.
Yeah, but at any rate, it was out of the question. That would have been the last thing in the world I would have accepted. First place, I had 3 children. And Ray Jenkins and I, when we were there, were the highest paid employees of the United States Senate. And it was $11,000 a year, less than $1,000 a month. Well, that just about took care of my hotel bill while I was up there, because my law firm paid all my expenses.
So
I didn't like Washington. I didn't like all that politics, and I think it sort of upset him that I didn't accept him. But
you just told him you weren't interested, and that's probably that.
Yeah, I had no interest whatever in doing that kind of work.
You know,
of course, if I'd have been single and footloose and fancy free, it might have been different. But I had 3 children then. My daughter was born while I was up there in Washington.
Well, tell me, you know, we sort of jumped right from your Air Force to your law career to McCarthy hearings without, we talked about your mother and father and growing up in Bolivar, but during the course of your very, very busy career while you were trying all these lawsuits. You and your wife had how many children, and what are their names?
Yeah, well, we had 4 children. My oldest boy is Junior, and he's a partner in this law firm and has been for 25 years now, I guess.
So Tom Prewitt Jr. is a partner of yours in this firm.
Yeah, he's 55, and then my second son, Julian, is, I guess, 53, and he teaches at Christian Brothers College. And my daughter is married, and she taught a little school before she got married, but she told me she never was going to work again. She's going to raise, she got 3 children. And then my youngest son, and there's an article in the paper today about him, he's works on movies. And he's got a book that's got a lot of old cars listed in it, and they made several movies in and around Memphis and Tennessee where he's been the producer of these old cars, these vintage cars.
Okay.
It's a right nice article in the paper today about it. So I've got 4 children, and unfortunately, my wife had sense enough to get rid of me in 1965. We got a divorce, and she died about 20 years ago.
Right, and so all the children are around close by here?
All of them live in Memphis.
Oh, good. Well, you know, earlier in the interview, we mentioned when you were arguing the case in the United States Supreme Court for the Park Commission that the case Brown versus Board of Education came up. Did you ever have any other time when that reference to the Board of Education case came up when Robert Kennedy was involved?
No, I don't think so.
I was thinking when we talked earlier, you mentioned that that you were with Bob Kennedy and his wife Ethel when the news came.
Oh, yes,
the Supreme Court decided
that's
that
right.
Case.
I forgot
that
about
was interesting.
It was, I believe, that Brown against Board of Education decision was announced in mid-May of 1954,
Right.
and during a recess of that hearing, I was out in the hall talking to Bob and his wife Ethel, and somebody came in and announced that the Supreme Court has just held that segregation schools are unconstitutional. And just instinctively, I don't know whether Bob said it first or I did, but I know I said, that's a mistake. And Bob said, I agree with you, and Ethel said, I don't agree with you. I remembered that because Bob later, as Attorney General, of course, was very active in pursuing the minority rights of the black people.
That's why I thought it was just very interesting that he would have that reaction and later would be known as the sort of champion of civil rights. And
that's right, but that actually happened.
Well, did you, you know, of course, you've lived through a long period of time where a lot of things happened, not only in the war, but in the South, and you had a role, I think, when Memphis in 1968 had its big labor dispute and the sanitation strike. How were you involved in that?
Yes, I was. Henry Loeb had just been elected mayor, and I had supported Henry very actively, and I was a member of what they called his kitchen cabinet, because we would meet about once, twice a month and discuss matters that were coming up. And it was just a few days after he was sworn in that the sanitation workers went on strike in Memphis. And then we met very frequently thereafter while the strike was going on, and Henry was adamant about it. He says he wasn't going to recognize any union. He particularly didn't like the idea of the checkoff for union dues. That was the main thing he didn't like about it. But I did a considerable research at that time, especially on the issue of violence. And I remember reading a decision by Justice Felix Frankfurter condemning violence for whatever reason. And of course, we would recite that to people. And we had such a violent time that the National Guard was called out, and they had tanks down here,
right,
patrolling the streets. And Martin Luther King came to town, as you remember, and Lucius Birch, I think, represented him.
he did.
But the first march sort of ended in a riot, broke up, and King was lucky to get out alive that day. But he came back in a few days, and I can remember turning my radio on, I believe it was. It wasn't a television. The night before King was shot, and hearing his sermon or speech at that church,
Mason Temple.
Mason Temple, and it was so prophetic. I remember Dr. King saying, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen over the other side, and I know where I'm going." He prophesied his own death that night, and then the next night he was no.
That's right.
But
Well,
just before that, a day or two before that, the day of King's first attempt to march,
right,
when it broke up in a riot, well, I told Henry Loeb that we've got to do something to get the black leaders to go on television and exalt the black people to peace. And he said, well, do what you can. Well, Odell and Horton was a city director of health, and we decided.
Now this is the Odell Horton that later became a federal judge here in Memphis.
Right, and Odell came from my hometown of Bolivar, and I knew him mighty well.
He was an African American judge,
and everybody thought well of Odell Horton, and still do. But at any rate, Odell and I arranged to meet at Lemoyne Owen College, Dr. Hollis Price. And I went by, they had a curfew on, but the police had my license number and car, so I went by and picked up Judge Ben Hooks. And his wife didn't want him to be in the car going over there to Lemoyne Owen College. I said, well, the police know about my car, and it's not going to be any danger. I assured her it was all right. So I took Judge Hooks, met him over at the Lemoyne Owen College, and we discussed this, trying to get blacks to go on television. And while we were doing that, Jesse Turner came in, and he was one of the leaders. I think he was president of the black bank.
Tri-State Bank.
Tri-State Bank,
right. And
he had blood all over his face. He said, the cops just beat the devil out of me. And he said, I'm in a mighty poor mood to go on television and exalt the black folks to peace when these white cops beat him up pretty good. But at any rate, they did agree, and they went on, but it was pretty late at night. Several of them did, to exalt the folks to peace. And then it was 2 nights later that King was killed. And then I was very active in trying to bring this strike to a halt, Jim Manier and I particularly. And we spent all night long in the Claridge Hotel with the union leaders. And I remember taking a Tennessee report, I think it was a case from Chattanooga, that said unions are unlawful in public employment, and they quoted Franklin Roosevelt saying that's intolerable and all that sort of stuff, and I kept reading it to these labor union people, and they didn't pay a bit of attention to me. But President Johnson had sent, and I can't remember this man's name, but he was sent down from Washington as a mediator. And he was the sharpest fellow I ever saw in my life. If it hadn't been for him, we never would have settled it.
And this was after King's death.
After King's death.
Finally, they worked out some arrangement where you could sort of get around the the law.
The illegality of a contract.
Right.
We called it a memorandum of agreement,
Right.
as if that made a bit of difference. But we worked it out, and that settled the strike. But it was very tumultuous times in the city of Memphis.
Well, it was interesting to me. I know you've referred previously to you representing the city, sort of adverse to the strikers, and then you represented the park commission during the integration times. But I also remember from my own experience that when an African American, your friend Odell Horton, ran for district attorney here,
Right.
you supported and helped him try to get elected.
I sure did. I went on television and with Louis Donaldson. I went on and Odell almost won. It was about 52,000 to 54,000. And I think he was lucky that he lost, because shortly after that,
became a judge.
he became a federal judge, and I was very much for him in that.
And you also mentioned that you had gotten to know Judge, or later Judge Ben Hooks. Did you have any involvement in
Yes,
Judge Hooks?
I did. Well, Judge Ben Hooks was the first black man to be a judge of record in Tennessee, the criminal court. I've forgotten which governor appointed him.
I think it was Governor Clement.
I believe it was, but at any rate, a short time after that, he had to stand for election. I believe it was 1966.
In other words, he'd been appointed as the first African American
Yes,
judge, but then he'd have to run in an election here
That's
in Memphis.
right, and in that race, the Bar Association got word that Judge Hooks was not going to seek re-election. And Jack Petrie, who represented the school board, and I were assigned the duty of going over to Judge Hooks and to try to talk him into running.
Had you been involved as an officer in the Bar Association before? Or?
I think I was a director back in my early days, but
Jack Petrie had been president, or y'all were just...
I don't believe either one of us had been too active in the bar.
Well, so what did you...
I don't know why it was that they asked Petrie and I to go over and talk to Judge Hicks, and we did, and Judge Hicks...
Judge Hooks.
Judge Hooks, yeah.
Yep.
But we asked him why he wasn't going to run. He said, I can't win. And I know Jack and I told him that we thought he could, and we said, if we can convince you that you can win, will you reconsider it? He said, well, I'll consider it. Well, we went out with a petition, and we got it signed by every past president of the Memphis and Shelby County Bar. And right up at the top were two men, Captain Walter Chandler and Captain William Morrow, both staunch segregationists, Old South. And I said, if we can get those two men to sign it, so we didn't talk to Captain Chandler first, because he was the key to it. And Captain said, oh, I can't do that, Tom.
When you say Captain Chandler, is this the Mayor Chandler's father?
Yes.
A congressman?
He was congressman.
Okay.
And he said, I just can't do that. And we said, Jack, we were in it together, and our position was, we've got to have some blacks on the bench, and Ben Hooks is as good as you're going to get, words to that effect. And we talked him into it, and he signed it. And same deal with Captain Bill Morrow, who was founder, I think, of Millsaps College. But at any rate, they both signed it, and every past president of the bar signed it. We took it over and showed it to Judge Hicks, and he said, I didn't think you could do it.
Judge Hooks said that.
Judge Hooks.
Yeah, right. And so did he then agree to run?
He ran, and he had no opposition. Of course, we published the fact that we had this petition, and that was the end of it.
Did you ever find yourself, of course, that's an occasion where you helped get a judge elected, but did you ever have to represent any judges, like Supreme Court
Yes,
judges?
I represented Judge Phones on the Supreme Court. He was elected, I believe it was in 1974. And he was first nominated by the Democratic, I guess, Executive Committee, the State Democratic Committee. He and 4 others, Joe Henry and Bill Harbison, and 2 from Chattanooga, Brock and somebody else.
Cooper,
yeah.
Yeah.
They were all nominated by the Democratic Executive Committee in 1974, and before they took office, Bob Taylor hired Fike Farmer, a lawyer from Nashville, who had been a classmate of Emmett Braden's at Yale Law School. But he was a little bit eccentric. And he filed a suit in Nashville, in the Chancery Court at Nashville, I believe it was. It could have been the Circuit Court, and the Chancery Court in Memphis. I think one of them was a will contest, and the other one was more or less Taylor's claim was that Phones had secured the nomination through fraud and conspiracy or something like that. It's a published opinion in the Supreme Court, special court. At any rate, we got it knocked out on motions both in Nashville and Memphis, and Mr. Farmer took an appeal straight to the Supreme Court. In those days, that type of case went straight to the court.
To the Tennessee Supreme Court.
Yes, and the governor, I believe it was, I'm not sure about who was the governor then, but at any rate, he appointed 5 lawyers from all over Tennessee. Had each grand division represented. That's governed by the statute.
To be the new Supreme Court.
Yeah, because all the Supreme Court judges were nominated by the same group. And of course, I argued that in Nashville, and the Supreme Court approved everything.
The special Supreme Court
approved.
The real Supreme
Well, that didn't satisfy Mr. Farmer, because 4 years later, in another case, Inman case, INMAN, that's reported too, he filed suit in some, I'm not sure exactly the format of it, but at any rate, he either had it in a brief or filed a separate suit. I'm not certain of this, Mike, but he claimed that the Supreme Court was elected through fraud, and therefore they couldn't sit on that Inman case. And I represented Judge Phones again. He came running to me, and I represented him again.
Okay.
And we got it knocked out, and we had another hearing before 5 other lawyers appointed by the then governor, and of course with the same result. But that second opinion, and it was at my instance, because I had read a case somewhere where the Supreme Court had enjoined a lawyer or party from ever filing another lawsuit like this. Well, on my prayer, the special Supreme Court enjoined Fike Farmer from ever filing anything that remotely was connected with that 1974 nomination. And those are 2 reported cases.
Oh, boy. Well, you know, how long now have you, as we sit here, how long have you practiced law?
56 and a half years.
And how many law firms have you been in during that period of time?
1.
And how many secretaries have you had?
I've had 2 secretaries. Miss Ann Crabb from 1948 to 1984, and Norris Medley from 84 until today.
And so you've had 1 law firm, 2 secretaries, and about how many lawsuits and matters do you think you've had to try during those 56 years?
Well, my first secretary, Miss Annie Crabb, kept a record all in 1 file, and I didn't know she was keeping it for many years. And somehow or another, it didn't get destroyed over the years. And I still have it, and I have it on this table today, and it shows every case I had during her tenure.
And that's just up to 1984.
1984. Now, some of them were personal matters, though. they were every files that she had opened
Right.
for me, and they weren't all cases.
But how many cases do you think are reflected in there?
I would
100
say
or 200 or what?
I would say probably 3,000 cases.
in the just up to 84, just your first.
No,
secretary.
up until the present time.
Present time.
Yeah, I'm estimating that pretty close to probably, and of course most of them are probably settled.
Yeah.
Uh,
Those were cases that you were involved in, and today, you know, we're right here at your office, and you're still. What kind of schedule do you have today, and what?
well, I can't try cases anymore because I don't hear well enough. I can't hear the witnesses, and I refuse to get hearing aids. And I frankly have had just about my fill of trying lawsuits anyway, but about the only thing I do now is counsel with the young lawyers. I enjoy that.
Do you try to come in to work most days?
I come in most days. I'll take off quite a bit. And I thought I'd be bored to death, but I'm getting so I enjoy it.
Well, you know, you mentioned we're going to have a time when you can kind of, we can sort of sum up, but from talking to you early, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. You identified when we were visiting about my mentor, Lucius Birch, and one of your mentors that you've mentioned in this interview, Ray Jenkins, as having common qualities that were impressive to you, and I guess that means something you think a lawyer ought to have. What are those qualities that?
Well, the qualities that both of those lawyers had that I admired so much, Lucius, and he's only been dead less than 10 years, and Ray Jenkins, they were very similar. Of course, they were both wonderful advocates on their feet, but they both had the quality of absolute courage, mental and physical. And the worst thing any adversary could do in respect to both of those lawyers was to threaten them. And I remember in Washington at the Army MacArthur hearing, I was in Ray Jenkins' suite the night before we were to commence the hearings publicly on television. He got a call, and I answered the phone from Walter B. Dell Smith, who was Chief of Staff to General Eisenhower in World War II, and who was then Deputy Secretary of State. And Eisenhower was president, and he was a full general. Of course, he had retired as general. And I answered that phone, and he was pretty gruff, said, "I want to speak to Mr. Jenkins." And Jenkins went to the phone, and I could hear him. And Smith said, "I'm not coming in answer to that subpoena. I've got something else I've got to do, maybe go to Europe." And Jenkins said, "Well, General Smith, I'll just send the U.S. Marshal out and get you and bring you in." And then Smith said, "You go to hell, Mr. Jenkins." And Jenkins said, "General, you go to hell." And we went over there that morning, and there was General Smith smiling to beat the band. He rescheduled his trip to Europe. Well, that was just an indication. And of course, I knew Lucius Birch so well and tried so many cases against him. And
well, I'll just interject here in this interview. Not only did you try many cases against Lucius Birch, I remember when those cases occurred, you wouldn't find any lawyers in any other courts. They would all be in there watching you and Lucius try those cases. You know, we've got some. You mentioned the quotation about the elegy in the churchyard, and Lucius used to always say, "There's nothing that you learn during your life that you can't use as a lawyer," and I think you've made reference to that.
Well, that's right. I remember when I was in high school, most of our teachers were old maids because they wouldn't let married women teach with 25% unemployment. And they were paid $75 a month. but I had this English teacher that taught English literature. And I wasn't too interested in English literature, but she made us memorize verses from the great English poets. And I was mad as a dickens at the time. I said, well, what in the world is she making us do that? But that's one of the great things that's happened to me in my life. And I've used those quotations in jury arguments. I remembered one from, I think it was Walter Scott, where he said, oh, what a web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Well, there's no telling how many cases I had where that was so pertinent. Fraud cases and chicanery, and I always used it. And it had to be pretty effective. Of course, you had to pick your shots. And then I mentioned earlier in this that quotation from Gray's elegy about so many flowers born to blush unseen. And to thinking back on that, my life, the luck of the draw. In World War II, I was just lucky, that's all, because thousands of young men in my position flying on those bombers, which was probably one of the most hazardous things during the war, and the losses were the greatest. And instead of being able to practice law for 56 and a half years, they're resting in cemeteries in Europe all that time. And I visited a lot of those cemeteries and walked down those rows and see all these young men that in the same age I was when I was over there. And then practicing law. Of course, I think first of all, I was lucky to have two great parents who a lot of people didn't have. And, but practicing law, I've known so many really fine lawyers, students, who never really got a chance. They either died too young, like Vince Beale, who was a graduate of Harvard, I think, and hell, he died before he was 35 years old. Great lawyer. And so many lawyers, like Bill Fisher, until he got lucky late in life, never had a chance to be involved in the real good cases that I had a chance to do. That was the one thing that I look back on is that I had such a great opportunity in such a variety of civil cases that it was always a challenge to me. But Lucius Birch had another quality. Lucius wouldn't turn anybody down for a long time, and I fell into that bad habit too. But it's been a great experience.
It sounds like it's been a wonderful career. We've got a little more time. Is there anything I
Yes, I do. I want to make three observations.
Okay.
About my life and my career. Sometimes I forget what I was thinking about 2 minutes ago, and I had to write it down. I wrote it down to be sure about it. And when I look back on my life as a lawyer, I viewed the law as a noble profession from the beginning until the Supreme Court of the United States 20 years ago handed down that case from Arizona and authorized advertising. And with that one stroke, they turned a noble profession into just another business, commercial enterprise. Now, and I have to say this about my own firm, because they have to do it this way. Expenses have grown so great that you got to think about money. And not that I didn't think about money, but it was never a very dominant thing. But now it's the dominant thing, making money. And I hate to see that. And I blame, to a large extent, advertising. When I go to and from town, I see on big billboards, lawyers with their faces, pictures on the billboards, advertising. The second observation I want to make is this. Mike, I'm concerned about the rule of law in the United States of America and the lawyer's place in it. And in recent years, I've seen the courts, the legislatures, and the profession itself more or less avoid any responsibility for what I consider to be a real tragedy in my profession, and that is the proliferation of these class action suits where lawyers advertise on nationwide television to try to get enough members of the class to file a lawsuit. And while it might help some people in the class, very few, but it's for one purpose, to make big fees for lawyers, so that lawyers now are the biggest contributor to one of our political parties. It's not only class action suits, but these products liability suits and medical malpractice suits. But I'll say this for the state of Tennessee. I think our judges and our legislators and the legal profession in Tennessee has kept it pretty well in line so that we don't have these outrageous things that are going on all over the country. But when you get so much money involved, then it's ripe for all sorts of abuses. I read in magazines over and over again where lawyers are making big contributions to judges who are running for office. There's got to be a scandal in Texas. So I'm very much concerned about the rule of law when people may lose faith in the judicial system. I believe in good verdicts, yes, but when I see that the Catholic Church is paying out millions of dollars to people who claim they were abused. I'm not a Catholic, I'm not much of anything, but paying out millions of dollars for alleged abuses of priests when it's so outrageous. But they must be doing it because of what's happened to our judicial system. They don't have faith in it. So I'm concerned about it, Mike. I've seen it all. I've been a member of the Association of Trial Lawyers since the beginning. But I see now this dominance towards big verdicts, regardless of the facts. And the third observation I want to make is the one I've already discussed, and that's the luck of the draw. I've been awful lucky in just about everything I ever tried to do. I was lucky when I was in high school. I was lucky in law school. I was lucky in the war. And I was lucky to get with some of the finest men that ever practiced law in Tennessee. Every one of them that was so kind to me. Mr. Seddon Allen, I know Judge John Swepston, when he was on the Supreme Court with my father, told my father that Seddon Allen was the finest chancery lawyer in Tennessee, especially on land matters. Well, I used to run to Mr. Allen anytime I had a land matter or something that was real complex. He would stop whatever he was doing and he would dictate it for me right there. Take 2 or 3 hours. And Mr. Ed McCann never tried a lawsuit, but I must have tried dozens of cases for him, and he would sit with me and he would never open his mouth. We tried a condemnation case one time for about 2 months. It was his client, state of Tennessee, when the interstate highway was going through, and he never opened his mouth in 2 months' time. But he wanted to sit there and we'd discuss it. And he was so helpful. And then, of course, Ben Goodman, who died about 10 years ago, I guess, or longer. And Ben finished high school when he was 16, and he finished Princeton when he was 20, Phi Beta Kappa, and he went on to Harvard Law School. But his office was always next to mine. And I did a lot of appellate work, and every time I'd get an appellate brief ready, I'd take it in to Ben and ask him to check it, and he would just ruin my grammar. He would attempt to change the substance, but he would just butcher the hell out of it. Well, I learned more about writing from Ben Goodman than I ever learned in school.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Tom, and I think a lot of us feel this way. What you're saying is that you've been so fortunate to have had the profession that you've had, and it's been such a wonderful life for you. But do you think that in this commercial world we're in now that the young lawyers get the kind of guidance that we got from these mentors that you mentioned?
No, I don't think so, because it's just natural. The dominant motive of them is make money, I think. And that's too bad. But we've got a lot of wonderful young lawyers here, but there's no escape from it. We didn't used to keep up with our hours, and we didn't have a meeting about money once a year.
And probably when you started your partnership here, you didn't have any complicated buyout arrangements or anything of the sort?
We didn't have a partnership agreement for 20 years, and we'd never lost a partner. And since then, it's a daily occurrence almost. Lawyers are jumping around from one law firm to another. Yeah. Jim Manier and I are great friends, and we came to the bar at the same time. And you know him, of course, and we've been so close together, and we still have breakfast every Friday morning together with other lawyers and judges. But Jim and I decided years ago that we were lucky to have lived in the glory age of the trial lawyer. And it has been that. It's been a great experience. And of course, everybody wants to make money. I had 4 children. I had to make some money to keep body and soul together, but it was a secondary thing. And in fact, my father told me when I came to Memphis, the only thing he told me, he knew all the lawyers in Memphis, and he had practiced law, and he'd been on the Supreme Court. He said, son, go down there to Memphis and treat people fairly, and you'll be all right.
And that's turned out to be
the case. And I think I've tried to do that, and obviously I've made a lot of mistakes, but that was the advice he gave me.
And I bet you had more fun when you were getting ready to examine a witness that somebody hadn't taken 3 weeks of deposition from before they ever got on the stand, and you had to kind of use your head about how to handle that person, didn't you?
Oh, yes. Every case is different, and that's the beauty of it. And that's the beauty of practicing law. You've got to re-educate yourself every time you get into a good case. So it's a great learning experience. And I think that's why old de Tocqueville, you know, who was from France, in about 1840, he came over and wrote a book about the United States. And he spent a lot of time talking about the lawyers in America. What a great thing it was, the legal profession in the United States. And when I said I had the luck of the draw, I was lucky to be born in the United States. There's no other country that compares to our system unless it's England. But growing up in continental Europe, where they got the Napoleonic Code still, I guess, but lawyers are fortunate.
Well, and I think the community and the bar here has certainly been fortunate that you grew up in a family that wanted you to be a lawyer in a country that would allow you to have those opportunities and to get in a law firm that you got into that gave you the opportunity become really the finest of the lawyers here at the bar.
Well, it's been a great experience,
Well,
and I haven't definitely decided I never will try another case, but I don't think I will.
well, if you do, will you let me know so I can get a few friends to come watch?
Well, I appreciate so much your willingness, Mike, to act as an interrogator.
Well, I hope it hadn't been an interrogation because it's been a awfully pleasant afternoon for me. Thank
Well,
you,
I
Tom.
appreciate very much the Bar Association and the foundation doing this, because I've got 4 children and several grandchildren, 7, and they've wanted me to put to print some of my experiences, and this is a good way to do it. I'm a little bit lazy about writing.
Well, I think they'll enjoy this one, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you. That it? Did we use up the whole tape?